Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. Back when Frontier Developments announced they were working on Realms of Ruin, a lot of Age of Sigmar players, including myself, felt a mix of excitement and relief. Excitement because it looked like a rather cool Warhammer RTS game, and relief because finally it felt like Age of Sigmar was getting a bit of love in the mainstream gaming world. Sure, we have had AOS games in the past, but this was a real step change and a chance to bring the game and setting to a much wider audience while showing off why so many of us love it so much. Needless to say, looking back after the game's release, it's been a bit of a bumpy start. However, at its core, I do think that taking all of the annoyances and shortfalls the game brings, this is one that succeeds on many fronts. So in this video, I want to take an objective look at the game, its good points and its not so good points, and answer two particular questions. One, has this game succeeded in creating a fun setting to explore and celebrate Age of Sigmar? And two, is it worth your time and money? Naturally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these two in the comments section below, but if you're ready to join me on this meander through Realms of Ruin, let's jump right in. Now, full disclosure, Frontier Developments did send me a copy of their Ultimate Edition of the game, and I want to say a big thank you to Nathan and the rest of the team for that. The people behind Realms are clearly passionate about the game they've created, and despite any comments we're about to share about it, it's important to remember that there are great and talented people who have poured their hearts and a lot more into it. And so I want to start with one aspect of Realms of Ruin that I think is unquestionably excellent, and that's the graphics. There is no question that this is an incredibly good looking game. Each and every unit looks fantastic, and you can clearly see the attention to detail the developers have given when translating these models from the tabletop to CGI, whether it's the polished auric sheen of the Stormcast armour or the minute grisly trophies of the Cruel Boys killer boss. And that attention is also seen in the various animations each unit has. I love how heavy and weighty Stormcast Liberators look and feel as they trudge across the battlefield, but there's so many little details that help to bring out the personality of each unit. The Ogroid Thaumaturge, for example, will subtly shift to holding its staff as a two-handed club when it's idle, quietly emphasising that there's also a brutish strength to this particular sorcerer. It's a small thing, sure, but it's storytelling in a very quiet but visual way, and I love it that Frontier have taken the time to think about it. And speaking of sorcery, the numerous special effects and abilities in this game are what really make it pop. I'm running a pretty dated graphics card by most standards, and even I was able to heal my units and blast apart enemies with dazzling displays of magical mayhem. In fact, pretty much the entire Disciples of Tzeentch faction have sensational abilities in some form or another, and seeing those in action has really given me a new appreciation for the army, not least because while we see so much of this already in artwork from Age of Sigmar, it's rarely brought to life quite as spectacularly as this. The game's setting of Gur is also really well presented. Each map is strewn with an abundance of primordial flora, ruined buildings, and the remains of those who have fallen afoul of the realm's brutal inhabitants, hitting home that while AOS isn't necessarily as grimdark as 40k, it's still pretty grim. Again, as you can probably see here, there's a great look and feel to everything on the map, and even on my GTX 1080, the lighting and shading really does give a nice sheen and depth to the terrain, which now and again has drawn me away from the action happening all over the place, which I guess is a nice problem to have. On that note, in the game's Conquest mode, each map is AI generated, meaning no two are exactly the same, and that ensures you'll never quite get bored of scanning your surroundings or that they'll ever feel too familiar. Moving on, and I'm going to avoid spoilers here, I do want to briefly talk about the cinematics because there's two things that stand out to me. Firstly, they are the visual cherry on the cake for this game. They look great and there's a talented voice cast behind them which make each one a joy to watch, even if the game doesn't really explain too much about who's who and what's what. This is very much a game for fans of Age of Sigmar, but we'll come back to the story later. But because they're so good, they do make me wonder if Games Workshop would ever take the plunge and make a TV show like this. Sure, it's not quite to the level of Pariah Nexus, and I think my graphics card does show its age somewhat in this footage, but I would happily watch a story with a more polished version of this visual style, and I think many others would too. So perhaps this game is charting a new territory for Age of Sigmar in more ways than we might at first think. Ultimately though, you can tell Frontier are proud of how this game looks because they included both an army painter tool and a map editor. The former shows off a lot of what I've already said about the detailed translation from tabletop to RTS for many familiar units, and it gives gives you actual Warhammer paint colours to experiment with, but the latter brings an interesting creativity all of its own to the game. Specifically, it allows you, aside from the obvious map creation, to build dioramas and use the in-game models to create epic moments frozen in time. That's a feature that resonates so well with what Warhammer is all about as a hobby, bringing imagination to life on a tabletop canvas, and it's a feature that I think is both underrated with this game and should be something other Warhammer focused developers take notice of, because I think it could be more popular than it otherwise is, and you can tell Frontier and GW are keen to stoke that potential. All in all, visually this game is superb, and I only labour that point because it's a crucial part of my answer as to whether it truly does Age of Sigmar justice. But that said, it is ultimately a game, and that's where the problems arise. At its core, Realms of Ruin borrows quite a bit from the MOBA genre when setting out its own style of real-time strategy. Players start each game with a victory score bar and slowly whittle their opponents down by capturing and holding strategic locations called victory points across the battlefield. Meanwhile, holding other key areas called arcane conduits allows players to build bastions, some of which offer buffs and advantages to nearby units, while others generate an increased amount of command or realm stone, the resources that players will need to not only build additional units and bastions, but also upgrade them as the scale and intensity of the battle grows with time. Army sizes are also much smaller than you see in other Warhammer games like the Total War series, and I think the comparison to Dawn of War 2 is quite fair in so much that your unit choices feel immensely significant to how the game plays out, and making the wrong one can easily set you back or spell defeat. Fueling that weighty decision making is the rock paper scissors system that Frontiers added to the game. Each unit will fall under one of three categories: swords, shields and bows. Swords are great at beating shields, shields have an advantage over bows, and bows will do the same to swords. The result is a truly kaleidoscopic combat system where the momentum of one army can be turned around in an instant thanks to a few select units, and in principle it sets up an exciting back and forth as players react to one another's choices. Additionally, it also helps to promote the whole roster in any one faction. Unlike the good old days of Dawn of War, you can't simply build an army of the same heavy elite units and rampage up the battlefield to victory. You have to think about all the units available to you and keep each one in mind right up until the very end, because you might well need them, which is a sign of a well thought through game in my view. However, it's clearly divided players, and searching through the review comments and my own impressions, I think there's two main problems with it. Firstly, because of the triple threat system, Realms is a game that needs a fair amount of micromanagement at times. As new units join the fray, you constantly need to think about whether your own are targeting enemies that they're optimized for, and when you're trying to keep track of victory points, arcane conduits, resources, upgrades, new unit summoning, and just the general sense of what's going on, it's a lot to take in, and that's not everyone's type of fun. What doesn't help as well is that non-bow units won't attack an enemy unless you tell them to, and bow units have a select firing angle, so if you don't keep track of those, you may find one of your forces simply gets destroyed without really fighting back, and that was a bit too much hand-holding for my liking at times. Similarly, there's not a great UI to the game when it comes to quick unit management. It's very minimalist, which is great for the aesthetics, but there's no character avatars in the left-hand side like you had in Dawn of War, which means you have to spend more time grouping units into keybinds and tracking those on top of everything else. Truthfully, I got used to it after a while, but it's fair to say that the game gives you a lot to keep track of, but very little to help manage it, and that sense of overwhelm can quickly turn to frustration when you find the AI itself is quite a tough opponent. The other thing is that for many players like myself, we love to doomstack, whether it's building armies made up solely of Lords of Change in Total War Warhammer, or in this case, deep striking a bunch of annihilators into the enemy's camp. Sometimes just trying something wacky is the fun part of a game. However, that just doesn't work here. Throwing in that army of annihilators only succeeds up to the point your opponent creates a bunch of cheap sword units and clears you out, putting you back to step 1. That's deeply annoying for me, but it's exactly the sort of gameplay Frontier wants, and it's that lack of overlap that causes issues. Even Tabletop Warhammer encourages you to pick the units you like and run with them. Here, you're forced to play with the rather strict meta, and that's less fun and enticing at times. There's also other things that irk me somewhat. For example, with buildings and bastions, you can bring up the upgrade window by using the R key. However, with units, the R key triggers the retreat order, sending your units rushing back to your base, which you can't cancel. As you can imagine, that did catch me off guard a few times during the campaign missions, but to be fair, that was my mistake. But keeping things constructive, is there anything I would suggest that could solve a lot of my issues? Well, I think a different UI would certainly not go amiss, but even just having the option to allow your units to engage enemies automatically would just help take some of the pressure off. I do wonder if there could be a strict command setting that allows you to trigger unit auto responses, meaning players who like that level of control can have it one way, but those like me who want a bit less micromanagement could have it another. Ultimately though, anything I would suggest would be more quality of life changes, because the core game itself is still really fun and I enjoyed myself immensely while playing it. It's just sometimes I felt I was having a great time in spite of some of the game's mechanics and settings rather than because of them, and I think that's as much down to me as it is Frontier, and why I think sentiment about the game overall feels so split. Something I think that's worth remembering though is that Frontier at the time of writing this is not in the best shape as a company. They've struggled with recent releases, not just Realms of Ruin, and have closed their third-party studio and laid off staff to focus on the management style games that have set them up well in the past. That alone would make me wonder if Realms of Ruin maybe wasn't fully baked by the time it came out, with some modes, settings or AI features not being completed in time. But more so, the story itself feels immensely rushed towards the very end, and I will avoid spoilers still. If you've played through the campaign, you might agree with me that the epilogue and the final cutscene are just too abrupt, and it feels like there was a little more to it than what we saw. It's not a bad ending, but it's not the one I think the game feels like it's building up to, and that gets me thinking about Realms as a package and how much more was perhaps intended but not quite delivered. In fact, in the army livery, we see models for some of the characters that never actually appear in the campaign or not in any playable way, and that feels like an odd thing to work on and include if there wasn't at least one mission for them to show off those appearances in, but maybe in time we'll see something emerge. However, at the start of this video I posed two questions. One, has the game succeeded in creating a fun setting to explore and celebrate Age of Sigmar? And two, is it worth your time and money? In my mind, despite its lackluster commercial success, I think the game does a superb job of showing off the setting of Age of Sigmar. The units, the maps and the cutscenes all look incredible, and while the story is aimed at more established fans and feels somewhat cut short at the end, I think it offers an exciting glimpse into life and conflict in the mortal realms. But more than anything, the game has left me feeling somewhat inspired for new tabletop projects. As I said earlier, I was really blown away by how the Disciples of Tzeentch look and play, and thanks to the army livery tool, I've already laid the foundations for a new army in 2024. In that sense, the game has opened up a new frontier for me to explore in AOS, and that makes it a successful Warhammer game in my books. Is it worth your time and money though? In short, I think it definitely is, but not at the price points we've seen at launch. Multiplayer is somewhat hampered by the lack of players, and while Conquest mode will keep you entertained for many more hours after you finish the campaign, that mileage is sure to vary from player to player. I'd say if it ends up with a decent discount that you feel is worth 15 to 20 hours of gameplay, jump right in with no regrets. But at the same time, if we see story DLC or expansions, that may well change things, and hopefully a few things I've said in this review, but given the issues at Frontier, it's probably not likely. Whatever you decide, I think Frontier have had a really good stab at a major Age of Sigmar game with Realms of Ruin, and I'm sure in time we'll see it as one stone in a pathway of games that bring new and existing players to the setting. In this particular case, however, I think it just needs one or two more reforgings to really hit its potential. So that's a few of my own thoughts on Realms of Ruin, but what did you make of it? Have you picked it up? If so, what did you think, and have you any different thoughts to share? And if you haven't picked it up, what would you want to see that would help you to take the plunge? Let me know in the comments section. Otherwise, I want to say thank you for joining me today. If you liked the video, feel free to hit the button and subscribe if you'd like to join me for future Warhammer videos, and I hope to see you in my next one. Until then, however, take care.